What I would like to do is to keep on with this discussion between the relationship between poverty and growth, and then eventually get to policy discussions. Even though as I'll be arguing that we're pretty much ignorant of how to actually make these miracles happen, I won't get very deep into, or I'll get deep into the discussion. I won't get very clean conclusions in the end. So I'm going to go through some of the things that Bill Easterly writes in these 3 chapters of his book on the quest for economic growth, which had been listed in the invitation, and I will add a few things more. So this is a nice, I mean, I like it, quote from the book. He pretty much starts with this. There is an issue here which is about, I mean, we economists, I've kind of ended up by noticing this when I reread the book again to write these slides. We economists don't have very good press, and I even have a friend. There was some in Argentina. There was in the 90s some free market reforms, which in the end didn't. I mean, the whole process didn't end up well. So I'll show you in the next lecture. There was a huge recession, and many bad things happened at the end of the decade. But for a while, like for 7-8 years, the economy was booming, was doing very well, and there was kind of a sense that after all these free market reforms were not that bad. And then after the crisis, of course, the sentiment in the country kind of reversed. And then this used to be called liberal reforms at the time of the reforms. By the time the moral sentiment of the country became like this, have been evil reforms, they were called like new liberal reforms by some reason which I miss to understand, but then if you kind of think there were some good things done during the 90s in Argentina, you were supposed to be like new liberal, and then you were not a nice guy. And actually, a friend of mine basically had the view that new liberals were just people that like to see poor people suffer, and of course there might be some people that would like these reforms and also like the poor people suffer. There are many economists who don't. I'm one of them, and Bill Easterly is another one. So that's why I thought that would be nice to start with this. I mean, these rich people can eat more and buy more medicines for their babies. I mean, that's the big picture, and I want to argue that if there's more people that can buy more medicines for their babies, because basically the economies grow, and I want to insist on that a little bit more today. So my concern is still going to be that picture with these 5 kids which are barefoot in the mud, and how do we do to get a world in which the fraction of people that can take those pictures to their children is smaller and smaller and eventually disappears. So I'm just going to give some additional figures. So this is about infant mortality. These are all, most of the figures I'll start with are in this book. I mean, this is, if you haven't read it, it's really a great book. It's very fun to read, and there's a lot of very interesting stuff. Now, if you look at infant mortality, and then you get the countries of the world, and you make a distribution of the countries of the world according to their income per capita, and then you take the top 20%, the richest 20% of the countries, and then you look at the infant mortality in those countries, basically you get 4 in 1,000. Now if you look at the 20% poorest countries of that distribution, then you're going to get an infant mortality of 200 in 1,000. So that means that 1 out of 5 kids that are born, they die. I think the infant mortality is like before they become 5. So I have three, I mean, we're four at my house, right? I had one sister and two brothers, so we were four. If you wanted to have, if you actually have 4 deliveries, the probability that you end up at the end of your life saying, okay, I could grow 4 kids, is only 40%. Because this means that 20% is the probability that a child, when he's born, doesn't make it to the age of 5. So if you want to have 4 in a row, and you want to have the 4 of them making them after the age of 5, that probability is 40%. So half of the couples that try this experiment of having 4 kids because they want to have 4 kids, more than half of them are going to fail because some of their kids are going to die. These 2 million children die every year just by dehydration from diarrhea. There was an outburst of cholera in Peru in the early 90s, which actually spread to some other countries in South America. And basically, I mean, if you get it, it's really nasty, because then you have diarrhea for many, many days. Now, you can only die by cholera if you just get dehydrated. That's how you say it. So if you keep on drinking water, it's just nasty, but nothing else will happen to you. So and there are many kids that died because of this outburst. Now the therapy is just giving safe water to these kids, and the dose is just 10 cents. So when you start thinking in terms, then there is like a tricky comparison, right? You can say, well, okay, how much money do I spend by dining out every year? I'm going to just cut my dining out a half, and then I'm going to eat at home. Then you're going to save many, many, many dollars. And then you can think, okay, so then I can save these many kids. Well, there's still a problem because the money is in your pocket. So from the money being in your pocket to actually getting the doses in the places where you need to have them, then it's of course much more expensive. And that's part of what really bothers. It's not. This is not about like HIV. HIV, I mean, the treatment is, I mean, really expensive. I mean, this is, we know how to do it. You just have to drink water. They keep on dying. Now, when you look at the difference in the numbers, they're just huge. So, of course, one would like to try to understand what are the things that one could do in order to avoid this kind of disasters. Now, it turns out that GDP growth reduces infant mortality rates. And it's always hard to measure it in the numbers, right? Because sometimes you don't know if well, you had like a much better health system in a country, and then you reduce infant mortality, and then you also improve the health of the average worker, and then GDP grows. So the causality is hard to know just by looking at the data. Now what these Pritchett and Summers from Harvard did was just to isolate effects of GDP growth that they knew they were unrelated to health. Like, we know that a country that produces soybeans, when the price of the soybeans goes up, the international price of soybeans go up, then GDP grows. And you know that it's not related to health issues. So you can isolate these GDP growth numbers and then measure how much impact those numbers have on infant mortality rates. And actually they showed that happens. And if you take their estimates seriously, but of course there's always problems when you look at data, but if you take their estimate seriously and you assume that Africa grew 1.8% a year, more than what it actually grew between 1980 and 1990, then you would have saved like 1 million children. This is just a count. Once you have the estimates of 1% of GDP growth, how much you reduce infant mortality, it's just making the numbers. So the hard thing is just to estimate that effect. And of course there are standard deviations. This is not, these are just computations, but that, if you compare it with the casualties of the Civil War, you're pretty much on target. The Civil War was like 600,000, around that number. So this is, I mean, this was like the most significant event. I mean, I think that if you account all the wars of the 20th century of the US and you add up the casualties of all those, including the first and the second, you don't get to the Civil War. Right? So these are like huge numbers, and this is only one decade that I'm talking about. So I mean, this is huge. And I'm only talking about infant mortality rates. In the book, he goes through other things like the hunger, child labor, the effects of malnutrition, lack of education. All these things are related. You get higher mortality rates, lower education, lower nutrition levels, more hunger with low GDP. This is a very nice table, which is based on work done by Martin Rebalion and Chen, I forgot the first name, from the World Bank. So what they did is they went to look at the developing economies, so these are not the OECD countries. And then they basically call an episode like a 5-year period. So you get all these countries, and then if you have like 30 years of data for Angola, then there you have like 6 episodes, because then you have 6 periods of 5 years. Now for each of these episodes, they look at what was the average GDP growth in that episode, like in that 5-year period, and they get a number. Okay? And then at the same time, you look at what happened to poverty rates, and then you get a rate of growth of poverty for that episode. Okay, so now you have an episode is a 5-year period from a developing country, and that is going to be described by 2 numbers. How much GDP grew or decreased on that episode, and what happened to poverty rates. They do that for a sample of 65 developing economies, and they end up by having 154 episodes. So what Bill Easterly did was to just divide these 154 episodes in 4 groups. The 25% episodes that had the highest GDP growth, then he calls them strong expansion. Okay? And then the following 25% order in terms of the GDP growth were called moderate expansion. And then the following 25% moderate contraction, and the last 25% very strong contraction. And here what you do have are the average growth rates of GDP for each of those episodes. And what you have in here then is for the same episode what happened to poverty rates. So for all the episodes, this is 25% of the 154, right? So you are in the order of the 33 episodes. On average, in those 33 episodes, there was a 9.8 decrease in GDP, and there was a 24% increase in poverty rates. Then as you see that when you move from a strong contraction to a strong expansion, poverty rates, instead of increasing, they decrease. Poverty rates here are defined. Each country has its own definition of what poverty is. And here they have like a single definition, which is how many people do you have, the fraction of people that you have that live with less than $2 a day. $2, they're all adjusted by inflation and by the ability to buy goods in each country. Okay, so this is basically people that live with less than $600 a year. Those are defined as poor. And then this is what happens to the poverty rates in those countries. So there are 2 messages of this table. First, if you want to reduce poverty rates, then expansions are much better than contractions, and by a large amount. There is a second aspect of this table which actually he does not emphasize in his book. But look at the numbers. When you look at expansions, I mean, GDP grew by 8%. Here it fell by 10%. So this is a little bit larger than this. But this number is way lower than this. If you just assume the world is linear, which is not, but it's easy to make the accounts. If you assume the world is linear, for each year of contraction, you need 3 years of expansion. Because if you grow 3 years at 6%, you're going to be more or less around 24. Actually, you need more than 3 years, just to have exactly the same impact on poverty rate. So this is very asymmetric. You have major disaster, poverty rates skyrocket. Now you go back to the previous GDP levels, and poverty rates are still higher than what they were before the recession. So like when we had this crisis in Argentina. If you compare the poverty rates were around 22% before the crisis started. In the worst year of the crisis, it was 52%. Now we are up to the previous levels in GDP per capita. Actually, we are above, and poverty rates are still above 30%. So I mean, this is like, these are numbers which are large. Of course, so the question is, how do you get these things? And these things are not so easy to achieve. If you look at the sample of all these episodes, and then you look whether the inequality grows when the economy grows or not, you're actually not going to see any relationship between inequality and growth. Sometimes the economies grow and inequality goes up. Sometimes the economies grow and inequality goes down. For this particular sample that has these 65 developing countries and 150 episodes, there's no strong relationship. That means that on average, all incomes are growing at the same rate. Sometimes we get worried because inequality increases a little bit, and we of course might get worried because of that. Now, the bottom line is whether the poor are growing or not. Because even if inequality is constant, measured as which is the income of the rich relative to the income of the poor, if that measure of inequality is constant but the economy is growing, then everybody is growing at the same rate. Okay, so when you look at the whole sample, there's not a clear relationship, which means that on average, all incomes are growing at the same rate. Now I'm going to, after this page, I'm going to move away from the slides I sent you, and I'm going to go to some numbers on the world income distribution, and then I'll try to make the point there again. And of course, we can surely identify particular policies in particular countries that were very good in terms of reducing inequality, or that they were very good in terms of improving the quality of the poor, and I'm all for that. But if you look at this period and this sample of countries, basically what had a very sizable impact on the poor is GDP growth. So what I'm saying is that these policies can and are important. What I'm saying is that if we're going to be looking at the different world in 25 years, or in particular, if we're going to be looking at the different Latin America in the next 25 years, GDP growth will be growing at 4% per capita a year on average for 25 years. It's really going to make Latin America look very, very different. Now, I went back to some computations that Xavier Sala y Martin, who's a professor at Columbia, made on the world income distribution, and I thought it was fun. So I put it in my computer so we can all see it. So this you can get from his webpage. You Google him, and then once you take all the, I was going to say he's a serious guy before showing the numbers. He's not. He's a serious economist, but he's not a serious guy. So you're going to see a lot of weird pictures going around, but eventually you'll get to this thing. So this is what he did. You can get what most people do is to use when they talk about the income distribution of the world, they use the GDP per capita for each country, and then they show you that distribution. Now, of course, the income distribution within each country is very different. So this is not telling you too much about how many poor actually you do have in the world. So what he did is to get many countries, and then he went to look at the income distribution of each particular country, and then building from that income distribution and working with the numbers. I mean, this is not perfect. This is definitely, people have been debating whether this is the best way of doing it, but it's one of the best that we have so far. So building from the income distribution of each country, he made this income distribution of the world, year by year from 1970 on. And then, so basically now you have a show, this is basically the way it works. So what you have here is income per year. Notice that this is in logarithmic scale, right? So this goes from 100 to 1,000. So the jump from here to here is multiplying by 10, even though the length is the same. So if you're worried about like $2 a day, basically means that the poor is going to be someone that is below $700 a year. Now, $700 a year is going to be pretty much like here. You don't have to, this is not linear again. So $700 is going to be closer to 1,000 than just if you make it linear here. Okay, so it's going to be like a line. So this is 1970. Let's just make $1,000 a year. This is not much in any case. So if we define a poor, someone who's living with less than $1,000 a year, so all these people here were poor in 1970. What we have here is number of people. The number of people, and this is going to run from 1970 to 2000. So of course the number of people is going to grow over this period. So the whole gray area is going to be larger when we get to the year 2000. So this is what happens if you just run the world in 2 minutes from 1970 to 2000. Well, that's it. It's over. If you actually if you compute how many people is poor now with the $700 figure, the total number of people who's poor now is lower than what it was in 1970. I'm not talking about the fraction. The fraction is obviously much smaller. I'm just talking about the number. So the whole point. So let's go again. I'm going to go back and forth several times, and then you can pick your countries there. I'm going to do a couple, and then if you want, you can get into the. So, like the point is, fix your. This is like the number of people. Of course, if you look at the fraction, this is going to be like close to 40% of the total. That is below 1,000. So now we can go step by step. Like if I go, like here, I can go like this. So you see how, of course, the total number of people is going up. We're more people now than what we were in 1970. But also, the whole thing is moving to the right. So when you count the number of people here, it's less than before. And of course, relative to the total, is of course lower than before. So again, so this is where you can argue about what is the best way of getting these people rich. And redistributing means making this distribution with a much lower variance. And growing means you move all the distribution to the right. If you care about what happens with this, it doesn't really matter whether it's you're taking from here or you're just moving it to the right. And that's a little bit of the point here. So what basically made much less people here is that the whole thing moved to the right. And that's basically what we're talking about. This is the one I was going to say I like. I don't. This one that explains that you can get 2 at the same time or 3 at the same time, and then you also see this shows how important is Brazil relative to the world. But then I'm going to take out the world here so we can see Brazil. So you remember when people talk about Brazil having a very unequal distribution, well, this is basically what they're talking about. Most income distributions, they are like this, and then Brazil has all this bimodal distribution. This is in 1970. So if we go the whole thing, you say, well, things got better. But if you look at it, there's a point in which it stops moving to the right. That's 1980. Remember when I showed you the figures of Brazil relative to the US? The 80s was when Brazil stopped catching up with the US. So if you go all the way again, I'm going to go from here fast to 1980. So if you go, whoops, and now it's just going up. And then starts moving a little bit to the right again. But basically you have 2 decades. If you go from 1970 to 1980, it moves to the right. But then from there on, it's basically moving up. So it's the lack of growth that that is making all these people still poor. Now, the whole picture didn't change much. There are many more Brazilians than what they used to be. But you still have all these rich guys here and this mass of poor people here. Yeah.
Is this in real terms?
Yeah. It's all in real terms at the same. I don't remember which dollars of which year are, but there are also dollars adjusted to how many goods you can buy in Brazil. So this, like, you can, if you put here the U.S. together with Brazil, they're comparable. So again, you can let's just do that for fun while I speak. So here you're going to see it actually that until the 1970, this is Brazil, this is the U.S. So catching up relative to the U.S. is just moving this all the way here. So you see that in the first, actually Brazil moves better than the U.S. for the beginning, but then it stops. These things are very persistent. When you look at income distributions, they do change, but they change very, very slowly. What makes these distributions, okay, I said it was going to be the last one, but now I'll show one more. I think this is because there you see like amazing changes. Let me just put it in 1970. I think this is, well, so if you this is Indonesia, then this last movement is the crisis they had at the end of the 90s. So this is one of the countries, the Asian countries, that grew a lot. So if you look here at what happened to the fraction of people who lived on less than $1,000 a year, I mean, this is a totally different place. When you go there, it's been 30 years, and when you go there and you take a look at the kids and you take those pictures, there are pictures that look totally different from what they were before. So that's basically what makes the whole thing different. So how can we make more countries look like Indonesia? That's like the challenge. That's what one would like to do. So one of the things that that Easterly shows is, I mean, and he's been 25 years at the World Bank, so he's been in all these countries and has been following the policies that the World Bank has been supporting for the last 3 decades. So one of the ideas that has been very popular, particularly in the last 30 years, is that, well, there's nothing wrong with the word aid, right? You want to help, then aid is the word that you have to look for. The question is, how do you actually do it, and how do you think about it, and how do you expect that aid to have an impact on what you want to impact? So this is the simple way in which I modeled GDP in a country a couple of weeks ago, right? So this Y is total GDP, and then I said this is total labor, and this is the capital. This is the number of machines that you have, and then this ATJ is like how effective you are at combining labor and capital and producing output. Why do I have 0.4 and 0.6 there? Why did I write it that way? Because that's more or less the way in which it works when you put numbers from Latin American countries. Now, you can actually think, well, there might be situations in which labor is very abundant in these economies. You have a lot of poor people that are willing to work. So what actually restricts the ability to grow is not the fact that you don't have people to work, it's the fact that you don't have machines to produce, right? So one simple way to put it, and that's what I'm calling the AK model, or the Harrod-Domer model, is just thinking that labor is not really important, it's only capital. So let's just make the the exponent on labor 0, the two have to add up to 1. So if the one on labor is 0, then the one in capital is equal to 1. And remember that how do we accumulate capital? Well, capital at a given period, some of it can be destroyed by the process of production. So whatever you have left after a period of production is only 1 minus delta. So delta is like a depreciation rate. And then you have to invest. You have to, part of what you produce has to be used to, you cannot consume it, you have to use it to buy more machines or produce more machines and then have more machines in the future. So this is like a nice way of thinking about it, because basically it says that if you want to grow, you have to produce, you have to have more machines. To have more machines, you have to invest. And then you can start thinking, okay, so then it's a matter about giving money for people to buy machines, and then they're going to be richer. Now, let's just not focus on productivity now. I told you the first day that that's the key. So let's just assume that the productivity is like the same over time. It doesn't really change. This is consistent with thinking. I'm going to go one slide backwards. This is consistent with arguing that what is important really is the accumulation of capital. So this will be like poor countries have low capital, rich countries have high capital. And if you look at countries, that makes sense. So we're going to focus on this explanation, on the capital explanation. So let me just assume that this productivity is constant over time. So for country J, it's just going to be AJ. A number you want there. You can get it from the number. So that's a number like 1 over 4 is a reasonable number if you're going to work with a model like this. But it doesn't really matter how large it is for the point I want to make. So what is the growth rate of GDP going to be now? Right? I told you the growth is what makes the whole distribution move to the right. So this difference on income divided by the income is the percentage growth in output. If you replace with the equation I had, then it's AJ times K at T plus 1 minus AJ at K of K times K at T. Now you have AJ multiplying above and below, so let's just get rid of the A. So basically what this tells you is that the rate of growth of output is going to be equal to the rate of growth of capital. Now, why does capital grow? Well, because you have to you invest. This comes from the other equation we had there. So in the end, you get to an expression in which the rate of growth of output is just proportional to the investment rate. Here you have investment divided by capital, and here you have minus the depreciation divided by capital. Here I wrote it twice because I like that expression. So in the end, if you just replace capital by its value, which is output divided by productivity, this is what you get. Okay, this is a very powerful equation, because it tells you that if you want to grow, then you have to invest. And it actually gives you a very linear relationship, which is that the rate of growth is proportional to investment. And as long as my assumption that productivity doesn't change much, you have that proportion is going to be constant over time. So now you get numbers for A, and then you get it to your office, and then you say, well, I want Ghana to grow at 3%. Then you just compute how much the investment has to be. Okay? So that's where we go from this theory, from A to investment and from investment to grow. The rate of growth is going to be proportional to the investment rate. So these are things you can measure and you can actually compute. So the secret for growth is just high investment. Now, there are two very detailed experiences. Actually, one very detailed experience, which is the experience of Ghana. Ghana became an independent country at the end of the 50s, and then it had a government that was very welcomed by the international community. So many developed countries decided that that Ghana was a country that should be helped in the growth process. It was the first independent country in Africa. So they started building a dam, and then from the dam there would be like many other industries that would follow. And he goes through the experience very in detail. I'm not going to go through it, but the bottom line is that after all this investment, Ghana today has exactly the same GDP per capita than what it had at independence. It went down until '83, and now it has been growing at 2% since 1983. So it doesn't look bad now. I mean, the growth has been there for a couple of decades. It's not huge, but growing at 2% per capita a year, you double your income in 32, 34 years. So that means that it appears that in 25 years we're going to look at Ghana, and if it continues like this, pictures of the kids are going to look very different from what they are today. Of course, if it grows at 4%, then it's even much, much better.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So despite the investment, I mean, was the investment just going into people's pockets and not into infrastructure? Or?
No, some of it went into the infrastructure. He doesn't go through the computation of how much money went into and how it was distributed into different pockets. There's been some work in terms of what happens actually in countries with aid and whether aid fosters investment or not. Part of the literature argues, and some of the numbers support at least partially the view, that if you dump a lot of money, then you're not going to promote much investment but consumption. Which pocket it actually ends up being, you can argue about. But just dumping money is not necessarily a great thing. Even though there was the experience of Ghana, the particular dam, at least from what he tells, the dam was successful. I mean, the dam is there; it's producing electric energy. It just didn't have the spillovers that they thought at the beginning that it would have in terms of generating more investment for additional industries. Now, there is another experiment, and I scanned the graph, but it didn't look great, and you're going to see it now. So you can actually use the model. You can get these numbers, plug in, assume that all aid that went into Zambia became investment, plug in the model, and then compute the rate growth of output. So if you do that, this is what you get. So this is $1985. This starts in 1960 and ends in 1995. So again, this is a computation. You get all aid that went into Zambia every year. You assume that aid became one-to-one to investment. And then you use that equation, given that you know what investment is, you use that equation to predict what output should be. So if this actually had worked, then Zambia today would be a little bit richer than Spain. And that's the solid line. So it started at around $600 per capita, and it's actually below that. So this means that it should have been by 1980, it should have the same GDP per capita that Argentina has now, and by 1995 it should have been as rich as Spain. So dumping money didn't help.
Has this been parsed out at all for growth-focused aid expenditures? I mean, so much of aid is spent on relief and on education, health, that are certainly investments in human capital, but not in certain
necessarily in machines. So
yeah. $8 is somewhat misleading because so much of that is trapped in U.S. government employee salaries and all that kind of stuff, and Range Rovers and whatever.
No, okay. So of course you can. There's one implicit assumption here, but I think it's a fair assumption if you want just to keep on having these policies that don't look more than the aggregate. So the first one is that if we give $100, that $100 is going to become capital. Capital can be broadly defined. So if it were like health or for education, I wouldn't mind too much keeping it in the computations. Now, if they are actually going to somebody's pocket, of course, then you should put it, and probably that explains part of this huge difference. Now, now you can also think sometimes of aid going particularly to try to solve like hunger in a region in a particular period, and there you shouldn't be putting that money into the machines. I don't really know. I think it doesn't give the details of the computations, but what I think is that he just puts all aid in there. And my guess would be that most of it was probably thought as either investment in capital or health or education that I would feel comfortable putting it in together, because those are investments.
Percentage that are spent on salaries and all that kind of stuff is pretty much astronomical. I mean, aid is its own industry. So
No, I guess that probably there's definitely that could explain part of the problem. But I guess that you're going to the roots of what I think he argues, which is that that basically you have to look at incentives. So you put the money, and then what happens with the money is like a big issue. And of course, this is an absolutely dramatic example of what one would have expected to happen, and it didn't happen.
So if you put labor in that model, I mean, this seems like comparing it to the absolutely best scenario you could possibly have. I mean, I'm thinking if you put labor in that model, that expected growth would be a little less. It would still be huge. I mean, it looks like the difference is so big.
Yeah, absolutely will be. Yes, because if I'll go back. I'll put it back very, very soon, and then we can argue why you're right when you expect that then the increase wouldn't be that dramatic. But the whole point is that when you go through at least the literature that supported many of these programs, part of it was, I mean, come on, labor is plenty of people willing to work. The restriction is capital, so there's where you have to go, and that's part of the problem. And probably the difference is going to be substantial. If you just keep my 0.4, 0.6 numbers in the production function, definitely this is not going to grow as much. My guess would be that it would be probably halfway if you do that. So that I totally agree with you. That's like a big difference. So here you're just assuming that $100 of debt of aid becomes $100 of investment, and that is proportionally transforms into more output, which is not true when you have labor. So it's definitely going to be different. But again, so basically what this Harrod-Domar or AK model suggests is that high investment is sufficient for growth, and the evidence is clear that this is not the case. I mean, there's much more to the growth episodes than just accumulating machines. And I'll put back labor into the function, and then we can discuss on how this actually works. Now, there are of course several links in this channel, right? So the first one is whether aid promotes investment, which somehow is what you were pointing to. And then the second thing that you can do is whether try to and this you can look at the numbers. If you go to a more disaggregated level than what I have told you, then you can go to some of the developing countries and then look whether they had in a 3-year period how much aid they had, and whether that had an impact on investment in the following 3-year period. Okay, so you can do this type of experiments, and actually it turns out that you don't. Out of like the 65 countries that he has, he gets that happens only in like 11 of those countries. So actually you don't see, when you look at the data, a huge impact on aid on investment after that. Now there's a second issue that one can look at, and then it's saying, okay, maybe the problem was that aid didn't become investment. Had it become investment, then there would have been growth. So he also looks at the relationship between investment and growth. And the question here is, and I'm going to qualify it afterwards, but here you can ask exactly the same question that you asked before, but instead of looking at aid having an impact on investment in the following periods, you can look at investment having an impact on growth in the following periods. Then you can ask yourself the question whether is investment a necessary condition for growth. Basically, this means, do we always see investment booms preceding GDP booms? And the answer is no, not always. In many cases, you have countries that start booming, and they didn't have huge investment booms in the sample. So it's not even obvious that if you have a very low investment rate, you cannot grow. And actually, when I'll show you the numbers for Argentina, I will argue that part of that is you can actually see it from the last 30 years of the Argentinian experience. You can also connect the two exercises, right? One is whether aid promotes investment, and then the second whether investment promotes growth. So of the 138 cases studied, there is only one country that actually fits the experience, which means that when you look at aid, then you see that investment follows, and when you see that investment, then growth follows. Then he argues that 1 out of 138 is still in the margin of statistical error. So this doesn't seem to be the case. So there is a sense that this idea that you just go to a country with 2 or 3 easy recipes and you just plug them in and then growth will happen, well, that's not the case. And that's what we will call that social engineering. Probably societies are much more complicated. In a sense, thinking that you can just go to a country, tell them, well, these are the 5 things that you have, these 5 reforms that you have to do, and then here's a little bit of money for you to do it, and then you leave, and that happens. Well, that's like thinking that you go to Iraq, and then there's going to be a happy and democracy in a couple of years, and the economy will be growing at 3%. It doesn't work like that. I mean, people respond to incentives, and it's hard to think it like that. But if a society remained poor for many years, in the end, given the conditions, and I want to emphasize this, given the conditions, the people there found their best response to remain poor. So the whole point is that you have to try to understand the incentives of the people, and then eventually try to modify those. And that's very hard. And we don't really have like great theories that would help us and would illuminate the way in how to do this. Does this mean that nothing can be done? I'll argue no. There are many things that we know that we shouldn't do. But I guess that in the end I will push more the line that there are some things that if we do, we know we're not going to grow. Now, if we avoid all those things, will we grow? I don't know. It's not obvious. So at most I will try to push the idea that there are some necessary conditions for growth. And I don't know. Now going back to where we were the other day. So what do we know? If we go back to Latin America and we leave Africa for a while, actually we leave it for good in this meeting. So there's been very poor performance. This number, GDP per capita, relative to the U.S. was basically relative to the U.S. constant from 1930 to 1970, and then it went down substantially from 1970 on. So this basically, the U.S. has been growing less than the average of the world. So that means that Latin America has lost position substantially during these last 70 years. Now, we ended up by decomposing this equation and identifying these three candidates. One was labor per worker or per person. the other was workers per person, and the other one was productivity. So what we argued the other day, by looking at numbers, is that if this number is very different for different countries, well, it could be explained by any of these three factors. Now, employment to population rates were okay. No, there were no significant differences between Latin America, Europe, or Asia, and Europe and these countries from Europe and Asia had been growing. So the difference in the numbers didn't seem to be there, and the difference in the numbers didn't seem to be here. Okay, so it was not that the investment was very low and then and had been going down, and that's why growth rates had been going down, and it was not that people in Latin America didn't want to work. So then the difference had to be in this productivity, and this is. Well, I'll go back to what is this productivity. We can compute it very easily, but we don't really know how to define it. Oh, I went the wrong way. So, I'm going to go through a little bit more sophisticated growth equation, which is related to what you were pointing in the beginning, which is don't do 0.4 and 0.6. Don't do 0 and 1. Do 0.4, 0.6, which is what looks more like the data. And let's think about what this means. So I'm just arguing that if you look at the data, this is like a good representation of the data. And then I want to go through what does it mean. So what we discussed a couple of weeks ago, which is what I was summarizing in this previous slide, was that when you look at the suspects that explain why this was poor in Latin America, we looked at the numbers of these two and we say, no, it's not here, it has to be here. Now, in a sense, when you look at this equation, it has to be. It has to be there, and this is totally related to what you were saying. This equation depicts what we call decreasing returns from increasing capital. So the question now is not looking at the numbers and see which is the one that is to be blamed. The question now is let's look at the formula and see whether there is any hope for this investment to growth idea. And the answer is no, there is a 0.6 here. So this basically means that even if you double capital, you're not going to be doubling income. There is a very nice example that Easterly gives in the book, which is about how you make pancakes. But you know I'm Argentinian, so I'm going to tell you about how you make barbecues. And I'm pretty sure I'll be able to give you the picture. So imagine you all come to Buenos Aires and then we decide that we're going to have an asado for all of you. So an asado basically has wine, but that's in fixed proportions. That cannot be adjusted. But then you have bread, salad, and meat, of course, right? So a good asado has a lot of meat, and there's some leftovers. But you like to have the meat with salads and bread. Well, maybe I know you, but we like there in Argentina. So there you are making the barbecue, and then suddenly you realize, maybe I don't have enough meat. Then you put a little bit more salad. And everybody will eat, and then of course if there are going to be leftovers, that's absolutely no problem. Now imagine that you keep on increasing the number of people and you keep on adjusting by increasing the amount of salads that you have. Well, in the end that's going to be an awful barbecue, right? We're going to be all killing each other for a piece of filet mignon and then having tomatoes totally in excess. So you can feed more people by just increasing the salads. But eventually, if you want to feed people with a barbecue, with an asado, then you have to increase the number of salads and the number of and the pounds of meat. So that's exactly the same example of trying to make the economy richer by just increasing the number of machines. And this is what it's called decreasing returns. I can feed a little bit more people by just increasing the amount of salad, but I cannot feed a lot of people by increasing the amount of salad until I start getting complaints like, come on, this is not an asado. You're just showing us a picture of a cow, and then you're giving us salad. So that's the same with growth. How does this reflect on the equation that this has a 0.4 and this has a 0.6? If there was a 1 here and a 0 here, then it would be fine. Because that would mean that asado is just salads. So you keep on increasing the number of salads, and that's okay, you feed all the people. But with decreasing returns, no. So it's not only the fact that we see it in the numbers, it's that when you start thinking about the equation, the only way in which you can grow is to economize in your fixed factor. Your fixed factor is labor. You cannot have more than 1 worker per capita. Okay, so this number can never be more than 1. You have all the people working, well, this number is 1. So unless you economize, you manage to make more cars per people, there's no way to grow. And you cannot do it with this because this has decreasing returns. So this is the one that is left. So again, it's all productivity. Why is this called Solow surprise? Because Solow is the one who wrote the model, and then he basically showed this to be the case, and he got the Nobel Prize for that. And this has been a few decades ago. But it's the fact that you have these decreasing returns here that basically tell you, well, you can grow for a while with that, but you cannot make this 3% GDP per capita growth for 40 years. So we're back to our old friend. What is this ATJ? Well, J is for the country, T is for time. So basically what you want is that this go up over time. And if you look at the countries that we call the miracles, because they've been growing at very high rates, basically what happened in those countries is that this thing grows a lot. What is it? Well, we don't have like a great definition. Is it the way we combine inputs? Well, yeah, but what does it mean at the aggregate? And you know that if you have workers and machines and then you arrange them in a better way and you just order your shifts such that the workers work with the machines in a reasonable way, you can produce more output at the micro level. What does it mean at the macro level? You see, the way we organize production, you just change, instead of having one boss for all your workers, you have 3 different bosses, and then you put a boss on the top of the 3 semi-bosses, and then production goes up. Yeah, sometimes that happens. Is it how we regulate new firms and new products, like people that have great ideas and think they're going to do the Google, and well, 9 out of 10 of those are great failures. 1 out of 1 trillion becomes a Google, but 1 out of 10 ends up with a business. Is it the school system? We have beautiful examples at the micro level. If you have to teach this, the first thing you say, well, remember Ford? You had these guys that were each one making a car, and then he said, hey, why don't we make one that just specializes in working with the engine and another working with the doors, and he called this assembly line, and then with the same amount of people he was just producing more cars a day. It was just a brilliant idea, and then of course that's like a very nice example of A, right? You have the same amount of capital, the same amount of labor, and you produce more. So we have all these examples at the macro level, but we don't really know much about what is it that make it happen. And maybe the most amazing thing is that even we don't know much, there have been so many countries after the 50s, definitely not all, but there have been so many countries that have experienced these huge increases in productivity. So like if you look at like the whole world, it's like a great success story. Of course, there's like a large fraction of the world which haven't seen any of this success yet. But when you look into, like, who would have thought after the war that there could be countries growing at 8% a year for 20 years? I mean, it was totally an unseen experience. But the Industrial Revolution was about growing at 2% per capita, not 8% for 30 years. Let's not talk about even like let's not talk about Japan, Korea, or China now. Chile, for the last 15 years, it's been growing at 6%. That's 4% of GDP per capita growth. Totally unseen before the second half of the 20th century. So probably that's one of the most amazing things. We don't know how to generate these things. Now, there's only one thing I'll say before I finish, one thing more, which is to try to go and look a little bit deeper into the numbers. Now, if you look at the aggregate, like if you look at the A for Chile and you look at the growth rate over the last 20 years, it's going to be pretty stable. And if you look at this number for the US, it's going to be pretty stable for the last 200 years. Basically, A grows at around 1.8% a year. And if you look at, of course it oscillates because there are cycles, right? But if you look at 10-year periods, it's basically going to give you between 1.5% to 2% a year, this growth of productivity. Now, what happens if you look a little bit behind that? This is, I copied the one that was in Spanish. But it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter who's who here. But let me go back. I'm going to show you evidence from the US. Because you have data. That's like one of the advantages of the US. I mean, the two most studied countries are the US because they have data, and Argentina because we have experimented everything. But we don't have good data. So basically what I want you to think now is, imagine this production function like output as a function of capital and labor and this productivity. But instead of thinking for all the US economy, think in an industrial sector. Okay, think only in industry, and now think like a particular sector of the industry. You can still think that output of that industry is going to be a function of labor in the industry and capital in that industry. And there's going to be a productivity factor exactly as the one I had. So the nice thing of this, let me go back to, the nice thing of this equation is that we can measure this from the data. And if you have good data at the industry level, you can know how much labor you have in the industry, and you can know how much investment you have in the industry. So you can have this number, and this, and then you can compute this one using exactly this equation. Now, if you do that by sector, then you get the productivity growth by each of these sectors in that particular decade. That's from 1948 to 1957. This is from a paper by Harberger. I guess so he was a professor at the econ department here until the middle 80s, and then he retired. So what's the point of this picture? This is basically total productivity growth for each of these sectors in this industry. Promedio means average. So this is like the average for all the sectors. And this is not the growth rate per year. This is the growth rate for the whole decade. So on average, this was not a great decade for the industry. The industry only had a productivity growth of 6%. Now what happens when you look at each particular sector? Look, there were sectors with 70%. Those were like the boomers. 70%, that means that it's basically a 70% reduction in costs. And then you have farm products, other manufacturers, electric machines, food, mining, construction. So basically what I want to emphasize are these numbers here. Oh, sorry, no, the total for the sector was 11%. This 6% is the average of all the other ones that are not here. So these are the ones playing in the major leagues. Okay, this is the average for the ones playing in the minor leagues. And you have a huge variability here. Now when you combine all these things, then you get 11% for the whole economy, which is a little bit more than 1% a year. So first point, for that first point, I only need this table. There's huge variability across sectors. Now, what I'm going to show you next is the same table, but for the following decade. Same picture, right? You have major leagues, minor leagues, on average are only 3% a decade. Basically, these were like 18 sectors, which basically had no productivity growth in the decade. I mean, less than 0.2% a year. Total for the total for the economy is 11%. So you say, why do you show me again a table which is pretty much the same message as the one before? Because there is a second message. I want you to look at the names. You don't know what they mean because there's, unless you speak Spanish, but it doesn't really matter. The only thing that matters is that they're different. So the ones that were the top winners of this decade were not the top winners of this other decade. This is funny, because if you look at this is like a decade, I don't know, maybe it was not this decade. But I just found funny, the first one there is wood and timber. Of course, it's the manufacturing of wood and timber products. Okay, it's not when you grow the trees, that's part of agriculture. So this is the manufacturing component of wood and timber. And I mean, that was the winner of if you wanted to invest in stocks in that decade, well, it was wood and timber products in the industry. I guess one thinks about like high-tech stuff. No high-tech stuff. So there is a lot of variability when you look at one decade across sectors, and a lot of variability when you look at one sector across decades. They're not the same. Now, if you go to the 58 to 67, this is what you get. If you go to 67 to 70, 68 to 77, this is what you get. Huge variability. So we're trying to get at this ATJ, which is the average for a country. Is it common across countries? No, it's not. There are huge differences. Like I defined it the other way as the ATJ for every country as the AT of the US, which is the highest when you make these numbers, times this eta TJ, which is basically says how efficient you are relative to the US. Now, the numbers that you get are of the order of 0.2 and 0.3 for India. That's like a huge difference. Now, what is behind this? Well, let's just not talk about A anymore. Let's talk about these etas. What is behind this eta? Well, when you look at economies that grow, what you see is that huge variability across sectors and huge variability for a sector across times. So I think that what happens here is that you have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people that are every day trying to bring new ideas into the production process at the micro level. Now, when you put all these hundreds of thousands of people all together for the US, you get 1.5% increase on average a year. And that is very smooth. Now, there you have winners and losers, and there is a lot of people trying to be the winner, and many of them ending up being the losers. But on average, they just make this 1.2% or 2%. Now, by some reason, we have all these Argentinians trying to do the same, and on average, we get 0. Something is going on with all this, because if you look at across sectors for the countries that don't grow, there is also variability there. Some that do better, some that do worse. Somehow, we don't manage to put enough energy in order to get, on average, this 3% a year that would make the country be totally different 20 years from now. So, what is behind these numbers? I guess it's that creativity, hours and hours of people that basically try to reduce costs, try to make more efficient their own place. Then when you average all across the sectors, then you eventually get these positive numbers that go up. We kind of believe, it's not a no, but we kind of believe that it's much easier to do it for China than for the US, because many things have been already invented. You just have to copy them. When you have a leader which is much richer than you, well, you don't have to invent the wheel again. You don't have to just invent computers. They are already there. You have best practices in many firms in the developed world. Well, maybe just have to copy them. And maybe that's why from 1950 on, we had many countries growing at 8%. Because they were very behind the leader. It was very hard for England to grow at 8% in 1850. Because basically they had to make it all from scratch. Somehow it's maybe combining this creativity that gets you to have on average productivity growth with the fact that these people making this productivity growth can copy from the leaders of the world. somehow combining the two things, I guess it's what can make these countries grow. And what I'll do on my on the last meeting is just to take Argentina as an example, show you what happened with this A over time in the last 30 years, show you what happened with that in the last 5 years, and then try to make a forecast on what could we expect and why for the next 25. So unless there is, yeah.
I have a question. So this idea that there is a lot of variation in productivity gains across industries could be taken like an argument against specialization in countries. Because if you're a country and you're specialized in one industry, then you're not as better off as if you have many industries. And then one year, one improved productivity, the next is a different one.
I'm not sure how would I define arguments against the specialization. But let me tell you what I could define. Eventually, I would argue that this is an argument for not having barriers to exploring new sectors, more than just saying, I just don't want to be in a particular sector. Because on the other hand, what you do see, particularly when you're open to trade, that there are occasions in which countries find like a broad sector in which they're like very good at, and they start developing eventually new goods between that sector. So I'm not sure I would say you don't have to specialize. What I would eventually say is, what I would try to do is not to have very strong barriers to avoid the moving from one side to the other and then exploring other sectors. One of the things that happened in Argentina in the last years is that it was very, very small, but had been growing a lot. Just the production of commercials and TV programs. Just now it's booming. It's a sector that is booming, and now once you're there, maybe there are like many other complementary things that could eventually develop and then become. Or if you look at India, software has been like a huge thing. Now and they're exporting and they've been growing a lot. And I don't think you want to say, well, you've been doing this for 10 years now, forget about it, or don't just make clusters of specialization on this. But I say, okay, now go and get all the productivity gains you get from there. Now, eventually they might die down, and they will have to think about something else, right? Like you think in terms of once you had the productivity gains from the massive production of cars, then you had like a huge reduction in costs. If you look at the last 30 years, I mean, they have not been that great. So I would just put it, I wouldn't say it's an argument against specialization. I would say it's an argument not to think that you just make soybeans and that's what you're going to do forever. You have to just, yeah.
What the question is, the kind of communications that India is going into is not particularly capital intensive, and it's also, that's a change that could be responsive, but say a Central American country that's economy is currently organized around coffee production, which involves a few years for the trees to mature and that sort of thing. They can't be responsive, even if they take down the barriers to trade. How responsive can that be?
No, they might not be, and then it might take some time, or definitely the fact that you already have like a structure to produce coffee means that you have an advantage there, and that there are many things that you can profit from that. Now, what I'm saying is that if the economy is going to grow, it's because not because you're good at producing something, it's because you become better at producing something. Because the fact that you are good at producing something is telling you how much you produce today. Now, but what requires an economy to grow is that you become better, and that you can, with the same amount of labor and the same amount of capital, you can produce more. Then there is like a virtuous circle in which the fact that you become more productive, then there is an investment boom, and you accumulate more machines. Because in a sense, this decrease in returns that you have associated to capital depend on how productive you are. So giving a level of productivity, then you have this decrease in returns. And like if I can, with the same amount of meat, the same amount of salad, and then I put more salad to the point in which you're saying, okay, this is almost not an asado anymore, but then I become just very efficient such that I can feed twice as many people with the same amount, then I can push the salad margin again a little bit. But in order for the economy to grow, you have to become better at doing whatever you're doing or whatever else you can find and do. And of course, I mean, the economy is like many different sectors, and I imagine that producing soybeans and producing meat is going to be something that Argentina is going to be doing for decades. Now, the point is that if the economy is to grow, then it's about making more soybeans or more cows with the same amount of land, and essentially with the same amount of labor, because that's what increases total output per worker, and that's what makes the GDP grow. But I absolutely agree. But there are many existing things in particular economies that are going to condition what the evolution is. But what is going to be pushing growth is that you eventually find new ways in which not all the economy will be going. You see, there are sectors booming at 80%. So in order to get an average of 2, you're going to have sectors basically without productivity increases, and they will be still producing. But you need to have like some sectors in which productivity is growing and is growing fast, and that's what's going to make all the economy grow fast. Average productivity will go fast, and that's going to push wages up and then GDP per capita.
Two more. Well, I don't know where to go. I wanted to go back and ask you about your last point. So I'll go there. You said that England, after 1850, the growth was slower because they were starting from scratch. Is that what you were saying? And then the growth as other countries say build on that knowledge, it can grow faster. Is that what you?
Yeah, I cannot prove it, but that's not an established result. But it's a catchy idea, I would say. It's a nice hypothesis in the sense that when you had countries that started growing until 1950 were basically growing at 1.5–2% GDP per capita.
But are you talking 1950 or
1850.
1850? 1850. That's an interest. It's a counterfactual to the dependency idea. I mean, I don't know if it's an interesting concept, but it kind of contradicts the dependency idea.
Let me see if it does. Yeah, I guess it is. Well, if you think that this was just growth that had nothing to do with productivity, it was just a matter of profiting from relative prices and in trade, then let me take England out of the picture. But if you look at the U.S. from 1900 to 1950, I mean, nobody even imagined that it could grow at 5%. And nobody imagines that it can grow today at 5% per capita for 20 years. I guess it would be great. But we're more willing to put money that there's going to be some countries in Asia in the next 20 years that have been basically very poor till now, and they will be growing at 8% a year 20 years from now. I would bet, I would bet much more money that that happens than that you see France, England, Germany, the US growing at 8% a year 20 years from now. And I guess that what the idea that is behind that, again, I don't even have a decent theory, and I don't have enough data to have a statistic conclusion about it. But I think that the idea behind that is that if you somehow manage to have this engine of growth, this creativity that increases productivity, if you manage as a country, as a society, to make that going, then you have a long way to go until you catch up with the richest countries in the world. And when we've seen many of these countries Chile looks like a very, very good. And it wouldn't surprise me at all that Chile grows at 5% per capita a year in the next 15 years. Because it's been doing it. It has an environment in which people work. I mean, the real wages are going up, and they have a long way to go. Many things that have already been invented, they can adapt and use in their production processes. That's the idea that I was trying to push. But again, I mean, let me not talk about England in 1950 then. But that's in a sense, like, inequality in the world today is larger than ever in history. But because many countries left the $400 a year GDP per capita, and some countries are still there. And then the country became like a much more heterogeneous place, because a fraction of the countries are way better than what they were 100 years ago, and a fraction of the countries are pretty much there. And I think that world looks better for the poor countries than if all the world were poor. Because, I don't know, if we all get together with the football, we're not going to do like the Colts yesterday. But when you look at those, I don't even know how many you put in the field at the same time. I never counted. It's 11. So, but you can put 11 guys there and do that. So, if we have to get there, it's going to take much less time than what it took them when they basically invented the game. That's what we'd like to believe, at least. So that's a little bit the idea I was trying to push. Okay?
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.